Welcome to the History Maps podcast.
It is great to be back.
Today, we are setting sail into some truly turbulent waters. We're going back to the late 16th century, specifically to the Imjin War. This was a conflict that really threatened to completely reshape the map of East Asia.
Oh, absolutely. It was a massive, massive conflict. We're talking about a full-scale invasion of the Korean peninsula by Japan.
And their ambition wasn't just Korea, was it?
No, not at all. The ultimate goal was conquering Ming China. It was a war of attrition, a clash of cultures, and, perhaps most surprisingly, a war that was ultimately defined by naval supremacy.
It's funny you say that because when you think of that war, and specifically the Korean Navy, there's one image that just pops into everyone's head immediately.
The turtle ship.
The turtle ship, the Joseon, that dragon-headed, spike-covered, tank of the sea.
Exactly. It's the icon. It's the superstar of the era. If you go to Korea today and buy a souvenir related to this war, it's going to be a model of a turtle ship.
But today, we're going to push back against that narrative just a little bit. We're going to make the case that while the turtle ship gets all the fame, all the glory, there was another ship that was the true hero.
The workhorse.
The workhorse.
Yeah.
The absolute backbone of the Joseon Navy.
That's a very fair assessment. I'd go so far as to say that without this other vessel, the turtle ship would have just been a lonely, expensive prototype sitting in a harbor.
And we are talking, of course, about the Panokseon.
The Panokseon, the board-roofed ship.
So our mission for this deep dive is to really figure out how this particular piece of naval engineering, which, let's be honest, it looks a bit like a floating box compared to the sleek European galleons of the time, how this ship managed to save a nation from total conquest.
And we had a really interesting stack of sources for this one. We've got historical records from the Joseon Annals, which are incredibly detailed.
The official court records.
Exactly. And we're pairing that with detailed analyses of the major naval battles, like Okpo, Hansan, and of course Myeonyang. We're also looking at direct comparisons of shipbuilding techniques, Japanese versus Korean.
I love that stuff, the nitty-gritty.
Oh, yeah. We even have notes from modern model makers and maritime archaeologists who are trying to reconstruct the interiors of these ships. It's fascinating.
So let's unpack this. Before we even get to the war itself, we have to understand where this ship came from. It wasn't just, built overnight because the Japanese were invading, right?
No, not at all. It was the result of a long and frankly a somewhat painful evolution in naval design. If you go back to the early Joseon period, say, before the mid-16th century, the Navy was relying on a class of ships called Panokseon.
Panokseon, and what were these? Were they dedicated warships?
Well, that was the problem. They weren't. The government at the time was trying to be efficient, fiscally responsible.
I know where this is going.
Right. They wanted a ship that could function as a warship if needed, but during peacetime, its main job was transporting grain for tax purposes.
The classic hybrid vehicle problem.
Yeah.
It tries to do two things at once and ends up doing neither of them particularly well.
You've hit the nail on the head. The Panokseon was cumbersome. It was flat and heavy because it needed all this cargo space for tons of rice. But that design made it terrible for chasing down pirates or maneuvering in a real fight.
It was essentially a floating warehouse that happened to have a few soldiers on it.
A slow, clumsy, floating warehouse. And I imagine that became a real, tangible issue when actual threats started showing up on the horizon.
It did. There was an attempt to fix it with something called the Joseon under King Sejong. Sejong was a huge proponent of science and technology, a real Renaissance king. He tried to standardize the fleet, But
peace has a way of making military budgets shrink and standards slip. A long period of relative peace meant the Joseon kind of fell into disuse and disrepair. The threat just didn't seem immediate.
So when did the wake-up call happen? When did the admirals and the court finally realize, okay, these grain barges are not going to cut it?
The year 1555. That's the key date. The Three Ports Incident.
Sounds ominous.
It was. This was a period of really intense raiding by the so-called Japanese pirates, though they were a more complex group than that.
Right, a mix of pirates, smugglers, rogues, samurai.
Exactly. And in 1555, there was a massive coordinated raid, and the ASEAN commanders realized that their ships were completely, hopelessly outmatched. The pirates were fast, they were aggressive, and they specialized in boarding tactics.
Which a big, slow grain ship would be a perfect target for.
A sitting duck. The Panokseon couldn't handle the rough coastal conditions, and it certainly couldn't match the enemy's speed. It was a crisis.
So they needed a purpose-built machine, a pure fighter, not a hybrid.
And that is the birth of the Panokseon in 1555. They completely abandoned the dual-use tax transport function. This ship was commissioned for one thing and one thing only: combat.
And the name Panokseon, it gives away its most distinctive feature, doesn't it?
It does. Panok means board-roofed or superstructured. It refers to that upper command deck that covers the main deck of the ship. Unlike previous open-deck designs, this was a multi-decked floating fortress.
Let's get right into that design because visually it is so distinct. As I mentioned, you look at European ships from this era, and they have these deep V-shaped hulls. They're designed to cut through the big waves of the Atlantic. The Panokseon looks, well, it looks flat.
It is flat. It has a U-shaped hull with a completely flat bottom, a flat keel. And this isn't because they didn't know how to build V-shaped hulls. This is a very specific, very clever adaptation to the Korean environment.
The environment being the coastal waters, the geography.
Precisely. If you look at a map of the west and south coasts of Korea, you'll see they have huge tidal ranges, some of the largest in the world. When the tide goes out, the water can recede for miles, leaving these massive, expansive mudflats or tidelands.
Okay, I think I see where you're going with this.
Yeah.
So if you have a V-shaped hull, like a European ship or even a Japanese ship at the time, and the tide goes out while you're near the coast,
You tip over. You're stuck on your side, completely helpless until the water comes back hours later. Your cannons are pointing at the sky or at the mud. You are a sitting duck for a land attack. You're done for.
but a flat-bottomed Panokseon just sits there. It settles down comfortably on the mud and stays perfectly upright.
It stays level, ready to fight the moment the tide comes back in. It's a brilliant piece of environmental engineering.
That's amazing. It's like an amphibious design before amphibious vehicles were even a concept.
Yeah.
But I have to ask, doesn't a flat bottom make it slow? It seems like it would create a lot of drag.
It does create more drag, yes. It's definitely not a racing ship. It wasn't built for speed in the open ocean. But what it gives you in exchange for that top speed is something much more valuable in a naval battle: maneuverability.
How so?
A flat-bottom ship can pivot.
Like-
It can turn 360 degrees almost in place.
A zero radius turn.
Exactly. A V-shaped hull is like a car on rails. It needs to carve a wide arc to turn around. A Panokseon is like a tank. It can spin on a dime. And in the narrow straits and crowded island chains of the Korean coast, being able to spin around and bring your cannons to bear was worth sacrificing some open water speed.
That makes total sense. You're not fighting in the open Atlantic. You're fighting in a maze of islands.
It was the perfect tool for the job.
Okay, so let's talk materials. I was reading about the wood selection, and it seems like the Koreans were building these things to take an absolute beating.
They were over-engineered in the best possible way. The hull was made primarily of sturdy, dense pine, and not just any pine, but very thick cuts.
Why so thick?
Well, pine has a lot of knots. If you try to cut it too thin, it tends to split along those knots. So to ensure structural integrity, they had to use these thick, heavy timbers, which had the side effect of making the hull incredibly resilient to cannon fire.
So it's heavy and durable just by necessity.
Right. And for the really critical parts, the frame, the masts, and as we'll get to, the pegs, those were often made of oak, which is incredibly hard and strong.
You mentioned pegs. This brings us to what I think is the most fascinating engineering detail: the fasteners. How they actually held the wood together.
Yes, this is a real game changer. The Japanese ships of the time, and most European ships too, used iron nails and spikes.
Which seems logical. Iron is strong.
It is. But the Koreans used a different system. They used wooden pegs, usually oak, combined with interlocking teeth that were carved directly into the timbers themselves, like a complex puzzle piece.
Wait, hold on. Why would wooden pegs be better than strong iron nails? That just seems counterintuitive.
Think about what happens to iron when it's constantly exposed to salt water.
It rusts.
It rusts and corrodes. Over time, that rust eats away at the nail, the connection weakens, the hole widens, and the entire hull becomes brittle and loose.
Okay, I see.
But wooden pegs, when they're in the water, they absorb the moisture and they expand.
They swell up and get tighter.
They get tighter. The joint actually becomes stronger and more watertight the longer the ship is at sea. And because the pegs are wood, just like the hull, they have a similar amount of flex. They move with the ship as it twists in the waves. Iron nails are rigid. They work themselves loose over time.
So the Panokseon was structurally far superior in terms of long-term durability. That is a fascinating bit of chemistry and physics at play. It sounds like they built these things to last forever.
They were built to endure.
Now, you mentioned the board roof earlier. This brings us to that multi-deck system. This wasn't just about giving the captain a roof over his head. This was a fundamental tactical layout, wasn't it?
It was a revolution in crew safety and combat efficiency. The standard layout had multiple levels. At the very bottom on the lower deck, you had the oarsmen and other non-combatants.
And they were fully enclosed.
Yes, safe behind that thick pine hull. They were protected from enemy arrow fire, from musket balls. They could just focus on one thing: rowing and maneuvering the ship as commanded.
So your engine room is armored.
Perfectly put. Then you have the upper deck, the main deck. This is where the fighting happens. This is where your Marines, your archers, and your gunners were stationed. And crucially, this deck was high above the waterline.
The classic military advantage, high ground.
High ground at sea. The Japanese tactics, as we said, relied on boarding, getting onto your ship and fighting with swords. But to board a Panokseon, an enemy soldier had to climb up a significant height.
All while Korean Marines are firing arrows and gunpowder weapons down on your head.
It's like trying to scale a castle wall while the defenders are dropping rocks and boiling oil on you. It's a death trap for boarders.
And sitting on top of all of this was the command post.
Exactly. A raised roofed pavilion right in the center for the Sunjang, the captain. This gave him a clear 360-degree view of the entire battle, keeping him above the smoke and chaos of the main deck. He could direct the battle effectively, unlike Japanese commanders who were often down in the thick of the melee.
So you have a protected engine room, an elevated firing platform, and a clear command center. And how is this beast moved? You mentioned the oarsmen.
It was a hybrid propulsion system using both sails and oars. It typically had 2 masts with fore and aft sails.
Fore and aft sails. Can you explain that?
Sure. It's different from the big square sails you see on, say, a Viking longship or even the Japanese ships of the period. A square sail is great if the wind is directly behind you.
A following wind.
Right. But if the wind is against you or from the side, you're pretty much stuck. A fore and aft sail, which runs parallel to the ship's length, allows you to tack. You can sail in a zigzag pattern into the wind. This gave the Panokseon much greater operational capability in adverse weather conditions.
And when the wind died down completely, or in a tight battle?
That's when you have the oars, about 8 to 10 massive oars per side. And these weren't rowed by one man each. You'd have 4, sometimes 5 men on a single oar working in shifts.
That's a huge amount of manpower. What was the total crew complement for one of these?
It varied by the size of the Panokseon. They came in large and medium sizes, but generally you're looking at 50 to 60 oarsmen and sailors, plus about 125 fighting Marines. So the total crew often exceeded 150, sometimes approaching 200 men.
That is a significant floating force. Okay, so we have this flat-bottomed, thick-hulled, multi-deck tank of a ship. Let's bring in the adversary. What exactly were they up against? What did the Japanese fleet look like?
The Japanese fleet was designed for a completely different doctrine of naval warfare. Their main heavy warship was the Atakabun. It's often called a floating castle.
Sounds imposing.
It was. Big, boxy, with a large superstructure. But they didn't have many of them. They were expensive command ships. The real workhorse of the Japanese invasion fleet was the Sekibun.
The Sekibuni. So how did that compare structurally to the Panokseon?
It was almost the polar opposite in design philosophy. It was built for speed above all else. It had a sharp V-shaped bow designed to cut through the waves, and it was built from cedar and fir.
Much lighter woods than pine.
Significantly lighter, which made it faster, but also significantly weaker and more brittle than the Korean pine. And remember those fasteners we talked about?
The iron nails.
The Japanese ships relied on them completely.
So you have a ship that's lighter, faster, but much more fragile.
Exactly. And this structural difference dictated their entire tactical approach. The Japanese naval doctrine was grapple and board.
Getting close and fight it out.
Yes. They viewed their ships essentially as transport platforms for their samurai. The whole goal was to use their speed to close the distance as fast as possible, throw grappling hooks, lash the ships together, and then let the samurai jump over and turn the sea battle into a land battle on wooden decks.
Because that's where they excelled. Their samurai were, at the time, probably the most experienced and terrifying hand-to-hand fighters in the world.
Absolutely. They had just come through a century of constant civil war, the Sengoku period. If they got on your deck, you were in very serious trouble.
So the entire Korean doctrine had to be the complete opposite of that.
Precisely. The Korean doctrine, embodied by the Panokseon, was fortress at sea. Keep them away at all costs. Use your heavy artillery and that superior pivoting maneuverability to destroy the enemy ships from a distance. The Panokseon was a gun platform designed specifically to prevent boarding.
And there's another factor I read about that comes from this structural mismatch, the collision factor.
Yeah.
Because the Panokseon was so much heavier and sturdier, could they just run into the Japanese ships?
They could, and that did. It was a viable tactic. A Panokseon could ram a Sekibun and essentially shatter its lighter cedar hull, often without taking significant damage itself. It was like a linebacker hitting a sprinter. The physics were entirely in Korea's favor.
This is a perfect transition to the gun platform aspect. You mentioned heavy artillery. Now, when people think of cannons in the 16th century, they often think of European ships lining up and firing these massive broadsides. Was this a similar concept?
In principle, yes, but the technology and the history behind it were distinctly Korean. Korea had a long tradition of gunpowder going all the way back to a man named Joseon in the 14th century.
So this wasn't new tech for them.
Not at all. They'd been refining it for over 200 years. King Sejong, in the 15th century, had sponsored major improvements, increasing cannon range from around 300 meters to over 1,000 meters. By the time of the Imjin War, they had a standardized arsenal of cannons called Changtong.
And I love the naming convention here. It's so poetic, not just 24-pounder cannon.
It is, isn't it? It's based on the 1,000-character classic, a text used to teach characters. The sizes were named Heaven, Earth, Black, and Yellow.
So you had the Cheonja, Jija, Hayonja, and Hwangyu cannons.
Right. The Cheonja, or Heaven cannon, was the largest and most powerful. It could fire a heavy projectile well over a kilometer, some sources say up to 1,600 meters. Then you'd step down in size and range through Earth, Black, and Yellow for different tactical uses.
And what were they firing from these? Just simple round iron cannonballs?
They did use iron shot, yes, called Chulhuan, but the most devastating and frankly terrifying weapon in their arsenal, and the one that really shocked the Japanese, was something called the Daejeongunjeon.
The General Arrow. Just the name sounds intimidating.
It's basically a missile before missiles were a thing. Imagine a solid wooden arrow, but it's the size of a small telephone pole. It's fletched with iron fins for stability and has a massive pointed iron tip. You'd load this entire thing into a Heaven cannon.
And when that hits a Japanese ship made of relatively thin cedar wood.
It doesn't just punch a hole in it, it goes through it. There are historical accounts of these general arrows punching clean through one side of a Japanese ship and exiting out the other, shattering the hull, splintering masts, and taking out anyone in its path.
That is just terrifying. It's like a giant high-velocity harpoon.
It was a ship killer. It caused catastrophic structural failure. A simple cannonball might punch a hole that could be plugged, but a massive timber projectile shatters the very frame of the ship.
And that wasn't all, was it? They had exploding shells, too.
Yes. The Bigyeokjin Shanle, which translates to something like flying thunderbolt. It was essentially a timed grenade, an iron casing filled with metal shards and gunpowder with a fuse. You'd fire it from a mortar, it would land on the enemy deck, the fuse would burn down, and then it would explode, sending shrapnel everywhere.
So you have ship-piercing missiles, you have anti-personnel shrapnel grenades, and you have standard solid shot. And how many of these cannons could a single Panokseon carry?
This is the other huge decisive difference. Because the Panokseon was built of heavy pine and used those flexing wooden pegs, it could absorb the immense recoil of heavy gunfire without shaking itself apart. A single Panokseon could carry 20, 30, sometimes up to 50 cannons of various sizes distributed around the deck.
50. And the Japanese ships, the Atakibun.
Their largest ship, the Atakibun, could maybe carry 3 or 4 cannons total, and they were usually smaller caliber. If they tried to fire more or heavier cannons, the recoil would literally shake the ship's structure apart because of that lighter wood and the rigid iron nails.
That is a staggering mismatch in firepower. 50 guns versus 3.
It's not even a fair fight if the ranges are kept. It completely dictated the terms of engagement. The Japanese had to get close to board. The Koreans just had to stay out of grappling range, pivot, and fire.
Let's shift a bit and talk about the people operating these credible machines. We touched on the crew size, but what was life actually like on board one of these ships?
Well, it was highly regimented, as you'd expect on a naval vessel. You had the Sanjang, the captain, at the top of the command chain. Then you'd have specialized officers like the Hwapojang.
The gunnery master.
The gunnery master, yes. He was an absolutely crucial role. Managing the loading, aiming, and firing of up to 50 cannons in the heat of battle requires serious coordination and expertise. You'd have maybe 10 to 14 of these specialists on a ship.
And them pulling the oars?
They were called the noongun. They had arguably the toughest job physically. As we said, 4 or 5 men to a single massive oar working in shifts for hours on end. But again, their key advantage was being on that protected lower deck.
And there's some interesting modern research based on models that suggest they weren't just sitting in a dark, cramped hold, all right?
That's right. This is where the work of maritime archaeologists gets so interesting. Some reconstructions show that the middeck, between the oarsmen and the gun deck, had interior rooms with salmon or lattice windows.
So, living quarters.
Possibly.
Yeah.
It implies there was ventilation, maybe some level of relative comfort, which is important. It suggests these ships were designed for long-term operations at sea, not just short coastal patrols.
That makes sense. These campaigns could last for weeks. They had to be lived in.
Exactly. They had storage for water, food, and ammunition. They were self-contained, mobile fortresses.
I found one detail in the research particularly fascinating: the rudder. There's apparently a debate about its placement.
Yes, this is a great example of how we piece together history from conflicting sources. Many old paintings from the period show the rudder shaft running on the outside of the stern.
Which seems plausible enough.
It does until you try to build it. Modern model makers and engineers who have tried to replicate this design argue that it makes no tactical sense.
Why not?
Because if the rudder shaft is on the outside, the tilt or steering handle would have to be on the upper command deck. That puts your helmsman, the guy steering the ship, right out in the open. He's a prime target for enemy archers.
And if your helmsman gets shot, your ship is out of control. A sitting duck.
Right. And the entire design philosophy of the Panokseon is to protect critical operations. So the much more likely scenario, which later evidence supports, is that the rudder shaft ran through the interior of the stern, allowing the ship to be steered from the safety of the lower or middle deck.
Safe steering, safe rowing, safe gunnery. It really was a fortress at sea in every sense.
It was a complete tactical system.
Okay, so we have the machine, we have the crew, we understand the design. Now let's drop them into the absolute nightmare that was 1592. The engine war begins.
It begins with a shock. April 1592. A massive Japanese invasion force, maybe 160,000 men, lands at Busan. And the Korean land defenses just collapse almost immediately.
They weren't ready.
They were not prepared for the sheer scale of the invasion or for the battle-hardened samurai who had just spent a century fighting civil wars in Japan. They were professional soldiers up against a peacetime army.
It looked like the country was going to fall in a matter of weeks.
On land, yes. The king fled the capital, Hanyang, which is modern-day Seoul. It was a rout. But at sea, in the south, the Jeolla left navy, commanded by a then-obscure admiral named Yi Sun-shin, was intact. And they had the Panokseon.
And the first major test of this fleet and this ship was the Battle of Ukpo.
May 1592. This was the first real test. Yi Sun-shin's fleet comes across a Japanese fleet of transport and supply ships docked at Ukpo, and this is where the Japanese get their first nasty surprise of the war.
What happened?
Well, the Japanese commanders saw the Korean fleet approaching and tried to do what they always did: scramble their soldiers onto their ships, load up their muskets, their arquebuses, and rush out to engage in a boarding action.
But they couldn't get close enough.
They couldn't get close. Yi Sun-shin was a brilliant tactician. He knew his advantage was firepower and range. He kept his distance. And the Japanese arquebuses, which were so devastating on land, were almost useless against the Panokseons.
The thick pine hulls.
Exactly. At that range, the musket balls just embedded harmlessly in the thick wood. It was like throwing pebbles at a castle wall.
Meanwhile, the Panokseons are just sitting back, pivoting, and raining down general arrows and cannonballs on these stationary targets.
It was a slaughter. Yi destroyed 26 Japanese ships without losing a single one of his own. The Korean fleet suffered almost no casualties. It was a stunning victory that proved the concept. The Panokseon, used correctly, was practically invincible against the Japanese fleet.
And this brings us to the relationship with the turtle ship, because the turtle ship usually gets all the credit for these early victories.
The turtle ship made its combat debut shortly after Okpo, at the Battle of Sachin. But we have to be very clear about something. The turtle ship is a Panokseon.
It's built on the same chassis, right?
It's the same hull, same flat bottom, same propulsion system. They essentially took a Panokseon, removed the upper command tower, built a rounded, armored roof over the main deck, covered it in iron spikes, and put a fearsome dragon head on the front that could belch out cannon smoke or fire. It was a heavily modified variant.
So why not just build an entire fleet of turtle ships if they were so effective?
Cost, and more importantly, tactical role. The turtle ship was a shock weapon. It was an assault tank. Its job was to charge directly into the middle of the enemy formation, ramming ships, firing cannons point blank, and causing absolute chaos.
Breaking the line and sowing confusion.
Exactly. But you can't build a whole army out of just tanks. They are expensive and highly specialized. The Panokseons were the main battle line. They were the infantry and artillery. They would follow up the chaos created by the one or two turtle ships with overwhelming, organized broadside fire. They worked in synergy.
That synergy, that combined arms approach, really reached its peak at the Battle of Hansan Island. This is often called one of the greatest naval victories in world history.
July 1592. This is Yi Sun-shin's tactical masterpiece. The Japanese had assembled a huge fleet, and they were eager to find and crush Yi's navy once and for all. Yi knew he couldn't fight them in the narrow strait where he initially found them, so he used a very old, very effective trick. He feigned a retreat.
The classic runaway tactic.
And the Japanese commanders, overconfident and eager for glory, took the bait. They chased his small decoy force out into the wide-open water near Han's Island. And then, once they were lured out, Yi gave the order for the main fleet to turn.
And this is the famous crane wing formation, the Hakikjin.
This is it. And this is where that zero radius turn capability of the Panokseon becomes absolutely crucial. The Korean fleet, which was advancing in a line, suddenly pivoted and spread out into a massive U-shape, enveloping the Japanese vanguard who had raced ahead.
Like the wings of a giant crane closing in around its prey.
Precisely. They created a perfect crossfire, a killing zone. The Japanese ships were trapped in the center, being pounded by cannons from three sides. There was nowhere to run.
Oh, the result.
Total annihilation of the Japanese force. 47 Japanese ships were destroyed, 12 were captured. The Japanese admiral in command barely escaped with his life. It completely broke the back of the Japanese Navy in the early phase of the war.
And it proved that the Panokseon wasn't just a tough defensive platform. In the hands of a genius, it was capable of complex, elegant, offensive maneuvers.
Absolutely. But the war dragged on for years, and there was a very dark period for the Korean Navy. Through court intrigue and political maneuvering, Admiral Yi was stripped of his command.
A disastrous decision.
Catastrophic. His successor, an admiral named Won-kyun, was rash and incompetent. He led the entire Joseon fleet into a Japanese ambush at the Battle of Chilkilang.
And the entire fleet was basically wiped out.
Almost entirely. Annihilated. When Yi was finally reinstated in disgrace, he had just 13 Panokseons left. That was it. 13 ships against the entire resurgent Japanese Navy.
This sets the stage for what is perhaps the most famous naval battle in Korean history. The Battle of Myeongyang in 1597. 13 ships versus how many on the Japanese side?
The lowest estimates are around 133 Japanese warships, plus hundreds of logistical support ships. So realistically, 13 versus more than 300. The odds were impossible.
And this is where the sheer durability of the Panokseon design is put to the ultimate test, right? Because Yi basically parked his flagship in this narrow strait and said, "You shall not pass."
He used the geography brilliantly. The Myeongyang Strait is famous for its incredibly fast and treacherous currents. He knew he could use that as a force multiplier. But for the first crucial phase of the battle, it was essentially just Yi's flagship holding the line alone.
Why alone? Where were the other 12?
The other Korean captains were terrified. They hung back, watching. They thought it was a suicide mission.
So for a time, it was one Panokseon taking concentrated fire from dozens of Japanese ships trying to push through the strait.
Yes, it was surrounded. Japanese ships were bumping up against it, trying to get grappling hooks on. Musketeers were firing constantly. But the ship held. The high sides prevented the boarders from getting a foothold. The thick pine absorbed the musket balls, and its cannons just kept blasting away at point-blank range, sinking ship after ship that got too close.
It's an incredible image, one ship withstanding an entire armada.
Eventually, seeing that the flagship wasn't sinking, that it was actually winning, the other 12 Panokseons found their courage and joined the fray. Then the tide turned. Literally, the water current reversed direction as it did every few hours, and the Japanese fleet was thrown into chaos, crashing into each other.
A miraculous victory.
A victory that would have been completely impossible without the sheer, stubborn toughness of that one Panokseok. A Sekibun in that same position would have been turned into splinters in 5 minutes.
Absolutely. And this brings us to the final battle of the war. The Battle of Noryang in 1598.
This was it. The final act. A massive, chaotic night battle. The Allied fleet, Joseon and Ming China, were trying to stop the last of the Japanese army from retreating back to Japan. It was fought in the dark, hundreds of ships.
And the Panokseons were right there in the thick of it, using fire arrows and everything else they had.
They used everything in their arsenal. Fire arrows, thrown wood to start fires on Japanese decks, cannons. They were determined to not let the enemy escape. But tragically, this is where a stray arquebus bullet struck Admiral Yi Sun-shin.
On the command deck of his Panokseon.
Yes, he was mortally wounded on the same type of ship that he had used to save his country. His famous last words were to his nephew, telling him to put on his armor and keep beating the war drum so the men wouldn't lose heart if they knew he had fallen.
A truly cinematic end to a legendary life. So, looking back at the entire Imjin War, what was the ultimate strategic impact of this ship? Why was it so important?
It's hard to overstate. The entire Japanese strategy for conquering Ming China relied on being able to supply their massive land army through the Korean peninsula by sea.
Ooh.
It was their logistical lifeline.
And the Panokseon, under Yi Sun-shin's command, cut that lifeline.
Completely severed it. With their supply lines cut, the invasion of China became impossible. The huge Japanese army already in Korea began to starve. The Panokseon didn't just win sea battles, it strangled the entire Japanese invasion effort.
It effectively neutralized the samurai's greatest strength, their superiority in hand-to-hand combat, by simply keeping the fight at a distance. It's a classic example of superior technology dictating tactics.
And, as we said at the start, adapting that technology to the specific environment. That flat bottom, which seems like a disadvantage in the open ocean, was the perfect adaptation for the jagged, tidal coasts of Korea.
What happened to the Panokseon after the war? Did they keep using the design?
They did. It remained the primary capital ship of the Joseon dynasty for centuries afterward. They developed variants, of course, like the Bangpizian or shield ship, which had extra armor, but the core design, the flat bottom, the multi-deck structure, the heavy reliance on cannons remained the standard.
It's so interesting that despite being so successful and being built for so long, we don't have any surviving examples today, do we?
No, tragically not. Unlike famous European wrecks like the Vasa in Sweden or the Mary Rose in England, we haven't found a well-preserved Panokseon wreck. The very mudflats that help them in battle aren't great for preserving wood over centuries in the same way that cold anoxic water is.
So how do we know so much about them, all these details we've discussed?
It's like putting together a giant puzzle with most of the pieces missing. We rely on the Joseon annals, on tactical scrolls from the period, and on contemporary paintings. But in recent decades, the National Research Institute of Maritime Cultural Heritage in Korea has been doing incredible work building replicas.
Full-size, working replicas.
Both detailed scale models and full-size reconstructions. They have to essentially reverse engineer the ship based on these vague historical records. It's incredibly challenging.
It's experimental archaeology, really.
It is. That whole debate about the rudder we mentioned, that comes directly from trying to actually build the thing and having an engineer realize, wait a minute, this design from the painting doesn't work if you want to steer the ship and not get shot. You rediscover lost technology by trying to recreate it.
So to wrap this all up, the Panokseon, it wasn't the fastest ship. It certainly wasn't the prettiest ship. It didn't have a smoke-breathing dragon head.
But it was the right ship for the right time and the right place. It was sturdy, it was stable, and it was massively, overwhelmingly armed. It was a perfect engineering solution to a very specific set of problems. Shallow water, massive tides, and an enemy that wanted nothing more than to board you.
It's a powerful reminder that in history, it isn't always the flashy wonder weapon that wins the war. Sometimes it's the reliable, well-designed, unglamorous workhorse that just refuses to sink.
And it's also about the brilliance of the commanders who know exactly how to use the tools they're given. Yi Sun-shin knew the Panokseon's strengths and weaknesses inside and out, and he never asked it to do something it wasn't designed for.
A perfect marriage of man and machine.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Before we go, here's a final thought for you to ponder. We've talked a lot about how the Panokseon and the Korean Navy blocked the Japanese invasion of China. Now imagine for a moment if they had failed. Imagine if the Joseon Navy in 1592 was still using those old, slow Mingxian grain barges. The Japanese army almost certainly would have been resupplied. They might well have marched all the way to Beijing. The entire history of East Asia, and perhaps by extension the world, would look drastically different today. All of that history hinging on the design of a pine hull and some water-swollen wooden pegs.
That is a staggering thought, a true turning point.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.